Good morning, everybody. Today's proceedings are going to be live streamed. Anyone with a electronic device in the hearing room may report to the outside world what they've heard, but only after 15 minutes have elapsed. Such devices may not be used for recording or photography.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mr. Bart.
Thank you, sir. Could you give us your full name, please?
Eric Docker.
I understand that there are some corrections that you would like to make to the very fulsome witness statement that you've provided to the inquiry. First of all, on page 6, could we have up, please, 749045? Page 6, please. On the top line, I understand that the word for should be against and the word and should be but. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. If we could take that down now, please, and have page 93. Paragraph 293, the second sentence, I understand the correction is so that it reads that they would come over 2 days a week on Tuesday and Friday. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Subject to those corrections, are the contents of your witness statement dated the 18th of December 2023 true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Could we go, please, first of all, to tab 5 of your bundle, sir, 29267. This is a note for file produced by the Security Service in April 1986 when you first joined the SDS. It says DCI Tony Waite called at 12:15 on the 16th of April to introduce Mike Barber's successor, DI Eric Docker. Can you recall that meeting?
No, I can't.
It says, after lunch, at which we were joined by F4 and Security Service, newly arrived, I explained my role to Docker and invited him whenever the need arose to get in touch. Docker, whose last appointment was in the National Joint Unit, terrorism mainly Irish, struck me as being well disposed towards us, but deeper and more devious than his predecessor. Are you devious?
No.
Are there circumstances in which you might behave in a devious manner?
No.
Taking appropriate care for state secrets, what might have given the Security Service the impression that you were?
You would have to ask them that, but what I would say is on a first meeting, as this was, I would have adopted the principle I would always say to my young recruits. that you have 2 eyes, 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use those in proportion, you won't go far wrong. So I would have been listening far more than contributing to the meeting.
Had you worked with the security service before?
On occasions during my career in Special Branch from 1969, yes, I would have worked with them.
Again, taking appropriate care for state secrets, had you had any issues with them?
None that I can recall.
Were you deeper and more devious than Detective Inspector Barber?
Well, there are 2 parts to that question. Detective Inspector Barber, in my view, is not devious at all. I do not regard myself as devious, and I find that a very, very uninformed remark from somebody in the security service who has only met me on that one occasion.
What was your view of the security service's access to SDS undercover officers for debriefing purposes?
The access they had would be entirely dependent upon the officer concerned. I would have said to the officer, the security service would like to debrief you, are you willing to do that? If they said to me no, that would be the end of the matter.
And why would they be given control over that contact?
Well, it would depend. They may be in the middle of their deployment. They would have had their own reasons for either agreeing or refusing to meet the security service. It may be they didn't want to compromise their identity, but I don't know. You would have to ask the individual officer concerned.
If we could have up now, please, a document at tab B46, 36108. This is a note for file, again produced by the security service. If we look at the text on the first page, the context is essentially you are telling the security service that Chief Superintendent Parker was tightening up procedures relating to their access to officers. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And at the bottom of the page there's a comment. Docker has attempted to portray himself as uninvolved in Parker's decision to limit our access to SDS sources. I am not convinced, and recall a remark made by blank about him in this context. So here we have them again being a little suspicious about you. Were you, to put it bluntly, hiding behind Chief Superintendent Parker?
No, I do not recall exactly how this came about, but I do remember Mr. Parker saying to me that in future all requests were to be channeled through him and he would make the decision.
Was his decision one that you agreed with or disagreed with?
I was ambivalent about it. If he wanted to, he ran the squad, and if he wanted to make that decision, that was up to him. I would have been quite happy to have made the decision myself, but he took that away from me.
When you say he took it away from you, was that a decision you would have expected normally to take yourself?
Well, I was taking it myself in conjunction with the officer concerned until Mr. Parker decided he would raise the level at which permission was given to his own rank.
Did he tell you why?
Not that I can recall. I could guess, but I don't want to.
What was the working relationship like between Special Branch and the security service in general terms?
It's very difficult for me to answer that question because I wasn't privy to some of the meetings that were had between the security service and the senior officers in Special Branch. I think a lot of the time they worked well, but there were obviously occasions when it did not work quite so well between us, and I don't know what exactly would have brought that about. Perhaps it was a bit of mistrust between ourselves and the security service, and from the security service, mistrust of us, but I don't actually know.
Can you explain lack of trust to us?
In terms of how I would have perceived it, we never got any idea what they were doing with our product. We never got very much feedback from them. It didn't seem to us as if we were on an even playing field a lot of the time. I think they were very, very happy to take all the product from us, but not a lot was returned.
Nevertheless, did the close working relationship between the security service and the SDS contribute to a feeling that the SDS was an elite unit?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand your question. Contribute to a feeling from whom? Or
well,
who?
Maybe I should have started with, was there a feeling that the SDS was an elite unit?
Not as far as I'm concerned, no. It was another unit of Special Branch, and you worked there in the same way you would work on any other squad.
Well, the ways of working were profoundly different, weren't they? Because
yes.
SDS used the undercover tactic.
Yes, they were.
And there was a sense that officers were making considerable sacrifices to live undercover for many years for the sake of the job.
Yes.
And was there a sense that the intelligence product was valuable?
Definitely.
Did that not engender a sense that it was an exceptional unit?
Exceptional in terms of the work that they were doing, yes.
And elite in the sense that only a certain type of person was going to be able to do undercover work?
I wouldn't describe it as elite at all.
You have described it as not being bound by the ordinary rules. Was that sense in part because of the close working relationship with the security service?
Not bound by the ordinary rules, I would take to mean that the very nature of the job they were doing could not be done by a police officer observing every single rule and regulation that he or she may have to abide by.
Could we have your witness statement up, please? It's 749045, page 61. We have paragraph 199, please. You've written here, my understanding of the legal and regulatory framework in which the SDS operated was that the SDS concept was operating outside the rules and bounds of normal policing in the first instance, albeit we had authority from the Home Office to do so. I was not aware of specific rules governing the conduct of UCOs. Could you help us with the nature of the authority from the Home Office?
I don't think I can, because I don't ever remember seeing it. A specific authority for us to operate an undercover squad, I have not seen.
Where do you get, what is the basis for your evidence then?
I don't understand your question.
What was the authority?
Well, the authority came from within Special Branch and, as I understood it, from Home Office, to whom a report was sent every year to allow us to continue the operation.
And who told you that the authority came from the Home Office?
I don't know.
Was it an assumption on your part?
It may well have been.
And you never saw any written document?
Not that I can recall.
Was there anything to delineate which rules and bounds of normal policing applied and which did not?
Not as far as I can remember.
What was your understanding of which rules applied and which did not?
When I went to SDS, I had no knowledge of it, I had no understanding of how it worked, and I had to learn on the job. I do not sincerely believe there was any written document that said what we were and weren't allowed to do.
So when decisions fell to be made by you, first as a DI and then as a DCI within the SDS, what approach did you take vis-à-vis rules?
We would have worked on our experience. As a DI, I would have obviously worked with the Chief Inspector there, in conjunction maybe with the officer concerned. Depending what the situation was, I think I understand what you're getting at, we would come to a decision as to whether or not a particular operation could proceed.
Now, you've just told us a moment ago that you didn't have any experience or training, so in the early days at least that must have been very difficult for you.
It was, because I had no prior experience to fall back on.
Would it be fair to say you were left to make it up as you went along?
No, because I had a DCI, and we also had a chief superintendent who ran the squad, and they could be used for consultation purposes as well. So we did not make it up as we went along.
You were informed by previous practice?
Correct.
But without the benefit of any rules or guidance?
The only rules or guidance we would have used would have been those that applied to policing generally. They are not to commit a crime, that type of thing.
But your belief was that the unit operated outside the rules and bounds of normal policing?
Slightly outside them, but there were rules, such as I've just described, by which they had to abide.
You had, by the time you became the detective inspector, many years in Special Branch, hadn't you?
Yes.
But no prior service in C Squad?
Incorrect. I worked on C Squad in the early 80s.
Before you joined the SDS?
Oh, yes.
I see. How long for?
I think about 2 years before I passed the promotion examination and got moved to uniform policing.
And on which desk?
The right wing desk.
Recruitment of undercover police officers. You've described recruitment as being on a wing and a prayer. Is that a phrase you would stand by?
I probably wouldn't use the phrase now, but looking back on it, the way it was done when I first went there, one could attribute that phrase to it.
We'll come in due course to the report you wrote, which, amongst other things, did bring some procedure and order to recruitment. But is it right that the officers who you recruited, HN87, HN5 and HN25, were all recruited before your paper proposing revision to the recruitment process.
Now, you've referred to them by their nominal there.
We need to be very careful
Yes.
with HN 87 and HN 25 to respect the restriction orders. HN 5 is John Dines.
Right, I've got that one. What, the other one was HN 87?
87, yes, and 25.
Yes, and 25? Yes.
So, recruited in a way that you certainly have described in the past as on a wing and a prayer.
Yes, in terms of the way it was done.
Did you see, in those cases where the officer was married or had a partner, their wife or partner?
Yes.
When you met them, was that before or after they had been recruited into the unit?
Before the decision had been made.
And what was the purpose of seeing them?
Firstly, to look at their home circumstances, and more importantly, to speak to the wife or partner and to make sure that they were fully supportive of what their partner was proposing to do, and to explain to them how it may affect their whole lifestyle.
Anything else?
Well, we would look at the home circumstances, make sure if they were married, they were happily married, that type of thing. I can't think of all the things we went through at the time, but we would have been as thorough as we could.
Was there any consideration or discussion about the welfare of the UCO and whether the wife or partner might be well placed to draw to your attention any difficulties the officer was having?
I can't specifically remember asking that question, but it may well have come out.
Was there a feeling that a married officer would be less likely to become sexually involved with members of the public in their undercover identity?
That was always the premise. I'm not sure I totally agreed with it, but that would depend on knowing the officer that you are recruiting.
And where did you get the premise from?
It was my own thoughts, really, because when I was in a position as the DCI to recruit people, I knew of a few officers, even though single, and even though my commander was very much against it, I knew they would be good officers. And I think at the end of the day I was proved right.
Was there discussion as to whether or not being married had a deterrent effect on sexual activity undercover?
That, I think, was the premise. Being married would give the officer a reason to go back to their own homes and to their own families. I'm not sure that the sexual aspect of it was ever openly discussed, but of course that would have been a consideration.
I'm getting a sense that people are thinking about the question of sexual activity, but on your evidence are not saying very much. Did you get the feeling that other people might be thinking in the same way that you were?
What do you mean by other people?
Other people thought that being married might mean there was, for certain men at least, they would be less likely to get involved sexually with activists.
I can't answer that question. What other people would think, I don't know.
And is it your evidence you didn't discuss that aspect of the requirement to be married with anybody?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Well, put it another way, when you are seeking to persuade your superiors to recruit single men,
Yes,
which you did more than once, didn't you?
yes.
Was whether or not to use a phrase you've used in a different part of your witness statement, they were going to keep it in their trousers, a part of that discussion?
I cannot recall that specifically. It would have been, again, a consideration.
A consideration you have told us, but was it a consideration for your superiors?
I think that would have been a major consideration for my senior officers, yes.
And what makes you say that?
Because I don't think they would have wanted the problems that would attach themselves to officers having sexual relationships with other people that they've met in the course of their job.
Did they articulate that concern to you in any way at all?
Not specifically, no.
So are you able to tell us whether they really were concerned about that issue or whether they simply couldn't care?
I can't tell you what they thought.
And where on the scale were you?
It's something that didn't really come up, and I will say why, because if I had asked any officer to their face whether they were having any sort of sexual liaison, I would have been blanked straight away, or there would have been a total denial.
And why would that have been?
Because if they had admitted it to me, I would have looked at it very seriously, which may well have ended their career on SDS.
So can we take it that your evidence is that people knew full well that sexual activity undercover with members of the public was very wrong?
I don't know what they thought, but it's difficult for me to answer that question because it just didn't occur in the time I was there.
Was there ever any discussion at all during your years with the SDS about the topic of sexual relationships undercover?
To be honest, no, I can't recall a conversation in the office about that.
No one ever talked about the temptations?
No.
The self-restraint that was required?
No, that sort of information they would have kept to themselves.
We'll be coming back to this topic a little bit later, but for the moment I'm going to move on to deceased children's identities and the extent to which they were used by SDS officers to build their legends. We've talked about HN87, HN25 and John Dines. They all built their legends on your watch, didn't they?
Yes.
And did HN90?
Hang on. I believe that officer did.
And can I ask, did these officers check whether the parents of the deceased child involved in each case were still alive?
I don't know.
Were they supposed to do that?
There was no instruction, to the best of my knowledge, that they should do it.
If they were still alive, and if the target group decided to investigate, finding them would be a possibility, wouldn't it?
It could be.
And so in terms of the security of the legend, whether the parents were alive or dead, I mean, this is a ghoulish subject, but it was a relevant factor, wasn't it?
It could have been a relevant factor.
And are you sure that it wasn't one that was acted upon on your watch?
Not as far as I know.
Did the officers check whether or not the family was still at the address on the birth certificate?
I don't know.
That again is a relevant consideration to how secure the legend would be, isn't it?
It could be.
And also from the point of view of the family, the risk of them being confronted with what would be a very unwelcome occurrence.
A possibility.
And is it your evidence that that consideration was not taken into account?
Not as far as I know.
Your witness statement tells us that the age of the child had to be similar to the real age of the officer. We have seen a number of instances, for example, Bob Lambert, of officers adopting the identities of people who were several years younger than they actually were. Were you aware of that?
No.
Was there any discussion as to whether it would be better to pretend to be somebody younger or older?
No, not that I can recall. That decision would have been left to the individual officer concerned.
Do you know whether or not that's something that was discussed between the officers?
It might have been. I wouldn't have been privileged to it.
Did you ever hear a suggestion that making oneself appear several years younger would assist when it came to attracting members of the opposite sex?
No.
Was the question as to how many deceased children's identities an undercover officer could use ever considered?
No. They would research one.
Was that ever said in terms, or was that just your expectation?
The instructions they were given when they first joined were to research and be happy with one identity.
And if the target group the officer was deployed into itself used the practice, perhaps so they could give a false name and address to police upon arrest, what happened then?
I don't know.
John Dines used a second name of a deceased child's identity. He deployed it upon arrest after your time at the poll tax riots. Did you know that he had a second false identity up his sleeve for that purpose?
No, I did not.
If you had known, is it something you would have condoned or condemned?
I'd have condemned it straight away.
Why?
Because that is not the premise under which he was employed on SDS. He was employed to use one undercover identity.
But if he had said he needed to do it because the rest of his group were doing it and it was necessary for his cover and for operational security?
I would have needed to go into that with him in great detail beforehand. Then that decision might even have been referred upwards.
On the question of the chain of command, you've said in your witness statement, I cannot say that senior officers in the chain of command definitely knew about this practice, but I think that in basic terms they would know how it was done. Could you help us with the basis for giving that evidence?
Are you talking about researching an identity?
Yes.
Well, it was always the practice when I first went to SDS that that was the way you researched your identity and then you developed it.
My question is directed at who in the chain of command above you knew that that was the practice used by the SDS.
I don't know, you'd have to ask them. I presume they would have had an inkling of it. I don't think they concerned themselves too much with it. It was a practice that had been established since the formation of the unit.
When senior officers came to visit, did you tell them that that's what you did?
In those respects, I don't think so. You're referring to senior officers,
Yeah.
say, of assistant commissioner rank?
Yes.
Commissioner rank? I don't think we would have discussed that particular aspect of it. They would have been more interested in what the officers were doing, what groups they were looking at, what the benefit was to the Metropolitan Police.
Did you withhold that practice from them deliberately?
No.
Did they ever ask how cover identities were manufactured?
To the best of my memory, knowledge, no.
Did you ever address your mind to whether adopting a deceased child's identity was legal?
Sadly, I did not.
Did you ever seek reassurance from your managers that the practice was appropriate?
No. Bearing in mind this is 38 years ago, it was established practice then, and I saw no reason to question it.
Did you ever review the practice?
No.
Were you aware that in the 1970s an SDS undercover officer was confronted with the death certificate of the child whose identity he had used?
No.
An officer called Rick Clark.
I know the officer you're talking about, but I don't know about that.
I'm going to read to you an apology made by the Commissioner at the start of this phase of the inquiry, start of this tranche of the inquiry, I should say. I'm going to ask you whether you align yourself with it or not. The MPS accepts that the managers of the SDS failed to recognise the hurt, distress and anger that the use of deceased children's identities would cause the families of the children and the public concern that would result if the practice had been revealed. It apologises unreservedly to the families for this. It also wishes to acknowledge that their distress will have been compounded by the revelation that some SDS officers behaved indefensibly while using their children's names, as acknowledged elsewhere in this opening statement.
As a practice, looking at it now, I don't condone it. But going back, as I've said, to the 1980s, it was established practice then. I didn't consider the wider ramifications of such a system.
You came into a machine that was already operating, worked on it for a couple of years and then moved on. Is that a fair way of summarising it?
I worked on it for 2.5 years. I made some recommendations for changes. During my tenure there, I had difficulties with certainly one particular officer, which will no doubt come out later on. And I hope that when I left it in a slightly better shape than when I started there, in terms of the administration of it.
And when you conducted that review, did you consider whether or not the practice of using deceased children's identities should itself be reviewed?
I honestly cannot remember what recommendations I put in that now. I'm not sure that came into it.
Yeah, there's nothing in there
Right.
about that. Is that because you didn't address your mind to it?
I didn't address that aspect of it. Perhaps I should have done, but there were other factors at the time which probably required a more urgent review.
And you simply discharged your terms of reference?
I did.
targeting, please, now, Mr. Docker. There is a reference in the 1985 SDS annual report, I appreciate the year before you joined, saying that an official from the Home Office, Michael Partridge, had an interest in anti-fascist action. Do you have any knowledge of that?
No, I don't.
Was there ever, to your knowledge, any influence from the Home Office as to the choice of the SDS's targets?
As far as I'm concerned, none whatsoever.
I've been asked if you could lean forward a bit closer to the microphones, please.
Sorry.
Or wheel yourself forward if you're comfortable sitting like that. Thank you. You say in your witness statement that targeting was the Chief Superintendent's decision, and late at the end of your time in the SDS we see some written documents about that. My question is, was it always the case throughout your time in the SDS that a new target was ultimately selected by the Chief Superintendent and not by the SDS itself?
Not always. The majority of times, the targeting would have been selected by the Chief Superintendent of the relevant squad, based on information from their desk officers. But there will have been occasions when SDS officers came up with a particular grouping somewhere that they might think is of interest. And in those cases, we would merely take that back to the squad chief, and if the squad chief agreed, then we would move to do something in respect of that.
What was your role in the process?
Well, my role in that process was merely acting as the middleman. I really didn't have any influence over targeting, unless, with experience, I could come up with some ideas of my own.
Did you have a view as to whether or not the Socialist Workers' Party was an appropriate target?
I considered that the Socialist Workers' Party was a target because the grouping would always jump onto the back of any issue that was current, and therefore they had an ability to foment public disorder, which is one of our primary roles.
And did you have a view as to targeting animal rights activists?
Well, for the same reason, animal rights activists were very active in hunt saboteuring, in placing devices, etc., and they needed to be targeted.
Did you look at animal rights activity as homogeneous or nuanced?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Did you draw a distinction between someone who was handing out leaflets outside McDonald's or campaigning for veganism on the one end of the scale to someone who was planting an improvised incendiary device in a department store on the other?
Of course I did. Of course I did.
And what were your views as to the relative need for intelligence about them?
What you have to understand as an undercover officer, you need probably a year before you will become at all productive. And in the start of that year, that's exactly the way you start, leafleting, that type of thing. And only when you get more into an organisation do you become effective at obtaining some intelligence from them. So the leafleting, the small demonstrations, yes, they were important, but not as important as the other end of the spectrum that you've mentioned.
And what was the importance of the small leafleting at a small demonstration?
If they had a propensity to cause minor public disorder, then obviously there would have been a liaison with local police. Most of the time, it would not really have bothered us, but it's as I said, it's a way in for an SDS officer, and therefore it's important.
Can I come to a specific matter now? This is the arrest and prosecution of an activist, Steve Curtis, at a demonstration in 1986 in Grosvenor Square following the bombing by the United States Air Force of Libya. You were shown in your pack some reports about this. We know that Mr. Curtis was arrested. We know that Bob Lambert was present. Mr. Lambert and 2 others were asked to give evidence for the defence. Our understanding is Mr. Curtis was prosecuted and convicted at first instance and then appealed both conviction and sentence. He was unsuccessful at appealing his conviction, but he was successful in getting a reduction to his sentence. There are some documents which you've been shown which show a discussion between managers which ended up with Commander Phelan stating that Mr. Lambert should not give evidence on Mr. Curtis's behalf, both because of the risk that he might have to perjure himself and because it might not help his cover if he was not supportive. Do you remember the case?
Not really. I have been reminded of it when I went through the paperwork about a year ago, and I have a memory, bearing in mind I was the DI at the time. The initial decision was taken by the DCI, Tony Waite, that accorded with the commander's decision as well, that he should not give evidence in the case. I had no specific role in that decision.
My interest is whether you can recall, whatever Commander Phelan's advice, did Mr. Lambert in fact give evidence as a defence witness?
I've no idea.
You tell us in your witness statement that if an officer committed a minor offence, the management advice would be that he should go through the criminal process in his own name, regardless of plea. Can you help us with up to what level of severity of criminal offence did that practice apply?
There is nothing I can recall that was written down which gave me a particular level to aim at.
So we're back to you being left to some extent to your own devices and past practice. In practice, up to what level of gravity of criminal offence were officers left to go through the courts in their cover identities?
Very minor offences, obstructing the footway, anything like that, which might result in a small fine and nothing else. That is the sort of guideline that I was told we could work on. It would, of course, have been reported up the chain as usual, but no more than that. Anything that went beyond that would not have been allowed and would have merited more investigation.
You said you were told in the course of that answer. Who told you?
Well, probably DCI. I can't remember. You know, do we allow these things, this thing to happen, this small demo to happen? He's been arrested, right? Fine, okay, nothing serious. Let it carry on.
That is a decision, isn't it, that requires the officer to appear before a court in a false identity.
Correct.
The court is misled.
Correct.
That's wrong, isn't it?
Yes.
Did you address your mind to it at the time?
No.
Should you have done?
Maybe.
You should have done, shouldn't you?
Maybe I should have done. But we're talking a long time ago, and that was the established practice then.
Did anybody ever express any qualms about that practice to you?
No.
Either above you in the chain of command or below you?
No.
Can we have up now, please, and it's a different topic, 742720. This is a report about the Animal Liberation Front. It's dated the 10th of October 1986. I'm interested in paragraphs 2 and 3. You will see from paragraph 2 that this is a report about the printing of leaflets, and in paragraph 3 that a printer is going to print some McDonald's fact sheets for London Greenpeace, which are recorded and described as a clearly libelous publication, certain to be of interest to the lawyers of this worldwide hamburger chain. Can you help us with what was done with this intelligence?
I have only the vaguest recollection of this. I think this is fairly early on of my tenure in SDS. I do not know what happened after that report was submitted.
Was there contact between Special Branch and McDonald's?
As far as I'm concerned, no direct contact at all.
I'm not asking about you personally, I'm asking about Special Branch.
I don't know.
There was a campaign running against McDonald's, wasn't there?
Yes, I believe so.
And that wasn't just limited to leafleting outside their premises. There were instances of criminal damage, weren't there?
Apparently so, yes.
Do you know whether McDonald's was seeking the assistance of the police to deal with this criminality?
Working on the SDS, I would have had no knowledge about that whatsoever.
Was there any direction feeding down to you that this was something of importance?
Not that I can remember.
Was there any feedback for the reporting on McDonald's?
I don't know.
Do you know a man called, or did you know a man called Sid Nicholson, who worked for security in McDonald's but had been a police officer in the Metropolitan Police?
No, I don't.
Are you sure about that?
I'm pretty certain.
A man called Terry Carroll?
No.
Can you ever recall being given any assistance by McDonald's for the purposes of policing?
No, not at all.
Were you ever aware of people, private detectives, infiltrating London Greenpeace, paid for by McDonald's or anybody else?
I can't remember anything about that.
Does that mean it might have happened and you've forgotten it?
Well, it might have done, but I don't remember it.
The inquiries had some evidence to the effect that McDonald's knew that Special Branch had a source within London Greenpeace. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Do you know whether, and if so, to what extent, Bob Lambert participated in the creation of the McDonald's fact sheet that is the subject of this report?
I have no knowledge about that whatsoever.
How closely did you keep in touch with Bob Lambert's deployment?
If I'm correct in what I said, that this is a report dated in October 1986?
Yeah, relatively early days, 6 months in.
Early days. I would not have had, I don't think, a lot of input into this. That would have probably been through the DCI, who would have been much more familiar with what was going on in terms of the officers' deployment and London Greenpeace.
Were you talking to Bob Lambert at the meetings in the safe house?
Well, I must have done.
And one of the things you would want to know was how he was getting on?
Probably.
What he was doing? Would you at the time have known whether or not he was writing a leaflet?
Well, I have no memory of that whatsoever, and I suspect if I'd asked him, he'd have said he wasn't writing it anyway.
Could you help with, you have no memory of that, but you do have memories of other things, or whether your memory generally of the level of communication is very vague?
You're asking me about meetings which we used to have twice a week, which I had for 2.5 years with undercover officers, and you asked me if I've got a memory about early on in my career there. No, I haven't.
Can you help us in general terms with the level of granularity with which you kept up with undercover officers' deployments?
Well, in general, at the meetings twice a week, we would go through each officer, what they'd been doing, what they were up to, what was coming up, looking for things that may be more important than others, that type of thing. We would need to have a comprehensive review. That was the DCI's job, going through everything that was happening.
Did the phrase, or if you can't remember, would the phrase clearly libellous have leapt off the page to you?
It might have done at the time. I can't recall it that much, otherwise something would have retained itself in my brain, but that doesn't ring a bell. I have seen this report before, probably when I was preparing my statement.
Can you help us with whether you did anything about it?
Personally, I cannot remember having any input into it at all.
Would you, for example, have spoken to Bob Lambert to establish whether or not he was involved in a clearly libellous publication?
As I've said, that would probably have been Tony Waite, the DCI, who would have taken that in the first instance.
Could we take that down now, please? Could we go to 740393? Now we're moving on in time now to the 13th of March 1987, just under a year after you joined the SDS. If we could go to the next page, please. This is a report dated, as I've said, the 13th of March. It's entitled the Socialist Workers' Party, but it has quite a lot of content about the Trevor Monaville campaign. Can I take it that you would have been familiar with the Trevor Monaville campaign at the material time?
I might have been, yes.
Could we look at paragraph 2 first of all? I'll give you a moment to read that, but what I'm going to ask you is, would it be a fair summary that this is a report of an SWP activist being appointed to the Trevor Monaville campaign's organising committee, but once there having little influence and being rather isolated?
Yes, I can see that.
If we go to paragraph 3, again, I'll give you a moment to read it, but would a fair summary be that Trevor's parents were focused in their aims and committed to legal avenues of protest?
That's what the report says, yep.
And if we go now to paragraph 4, give you a moment, but the question will be, would it be fair to summarise this as the campaign was likely to broaden into a campaign against police racism, violence and oppression, contra to the wishes of the family.
That's the intimation coming from this paragraph.
Paragraph 5. That to the effect that the SWP will continue to support the Trevor Monaville campaign and hold as well their own independent SWP events. I've taken you through that report so that I can ask some questions to explore why this report was made. Why report on a lawful campaign?
Well, I would view it as a report on what the Socialist Workers' Party's attitude is to that campaign, which would of course be of interest.
I can see that, but you also see from that report, don't you, that the SWP is A, getting nowhere,
that may be so then,
and B, insofar as it is forecast to get somewhere by broadening the campaign into one against police racism, violence and oppression, it's a free country, and as long as it's conducted lawfully, those are legitimate subjects of complaint.
Perhaps, yes.
And protest. And there's nothing to suggest that the SWP is doing anything here that's going to interfere with public order or be unlawful, is there?
Not at that point.
And this is very sensitive territory, isn't it? The police reporting on people who might be about to campaign against the police and a black racial justice campaign.
I'm not sure that is the point of the report. I still think it is the Socialist Workers' Party's attitude to this.
My question was slightly different. This is very sensitive territory, isn't it?
It would have been then, yes, and it probably would be now.
Was any thought given to the proportionality of this kind of reporting?
No.
Was any thought given to what a compromise of the undercover officer reporting on the Trevor Monaville campaign might have led to in terms of community relations?
Sorry, I'm not quite with you there.
If it had been discovered that an undercover police officer was reporting on a black justice campaign,
Right.
That could have caused a lot of trouble, couldn't it?
It could.
Public order
Yes.
trouble
Yes.
and serious tensions within police community relations.
It could have done.
Precisely the things that were the sensitive territory. Was any thought given to that?
As far as I can, my honest answer is no. The report would have been brought in, dealt with, moved on to the relevant squad and processed from there.
Was any thought given to Mr. and Mrs. Monaville?
It's very difficult for me to answer that now, but as far as I can say, the answer would be no.
Was it felt that black people were particularly vulnerable to extremists?
I don't know.
Well, what was the thinking about the SWP vis-à-vis the Trevor Monaville campaign?
I don't think I can answer that question because I don't know.
Well, what was the concern about what they might do?
The SWP,
Yes.
well, it could lead to public disorder. It's
By hijacking.
hijacking another campaign. That's what they do.
Couldn't Mr. and Mrs. Monaville be left to deal with those who wanted to support their campaign themselves?
I think, with the greatest respect to them, they're a byproduct of this report. I don't think anybody was particularly interested in policing terms of Mr. and Mrs. Monaville.
Was any consideration given as to whether or not they may be perfectly capable of dealing with all sorts of people with all sorts of motives and agendas approaching them about their campaign?
You asked if there was consideration given. As far as I'm concerned, I'm sad to say the answer was no.
Could we take that down now, please? Can we have up 747694? Dialing back slightly in time, this is December 1986. If we could go to the next page, so to page 3, please. There's a report here, 2nd of December 1986. It's about an individual, a woman who we are calling Lizzie. If you need to remind yourself as to who she is, please do so, but we're respecting her privacy and she's anonymous. It says, Lizzie, a former member of the South London Animal Movement, SLAM, has recently moved from privacy to privacy. This house is being bought on a joint mortgage with her policeman boyfriend, blank, who shares the accommodation with her. The subject is a close friend of Animal Liberation Front press officer Robin Lane and his girlfriend Tanya, and she maintains regular contact with both of them. Lane and Tanya also spend a considerable amount of time at the home of Lizzie, although none is believed to be actively involved in illegal direct action at the present time. You familiar with who Robin Lane was at the material time?
Vaguely, yes.
And his connections to, as Animal ALF press officer and connections with the ALF support group?
Yes.
A person of interest to Special Branch?
Yes.
Can you help us with the circumstances in which the SDS was able to obtain this intelligence?
Obviously from an undercover officer.
Did you know that Mike Chitty was spending a lot of time with Lizzie and Tanya and Lane?
No. Mike Chitty was finishing up when I first went on to SDS. I didn't really know much about him. I never learnt much about him. So the answer to your question is no, I didn't.
Would you ever, when you got intelligence like this, have been inquisitive about how they got it?
No.
The inquiry has heard evidence to the effect that Chitty, Lizzie, Lane and Tanya not only spent a lot of time together, but Chitty and Lizzie had a sexual relationship. Did you know anything about that?
Nothing whatsoever.
Did you ever get any inkling that something might be going on?
No.
Are you sure about that?
Well, I can't remember anything about it. As I said, Chitty was at the end of his deployment, coming to the end of it then. He was not an easy man to talk to, not very open, and he certainly wouldn't have mentioned anything to me about this.
Did that make it more or less likely that you spoke to him about how he got his intelligence?
I wouldn't have asked him how he got his intelligence.
Can we take that document down now, please, and can we have up 526 789? Thank you. Could we go to that? You will see first of all that this is about Mr. Lambert's arrest in Horsham. It's at a large hunt sabotage event. If we could go to through to 4, please. And if we could expand the report, thanks. It's 3rd of March 1987. The narrative about the arrest starts at paragraph 4. Can I leave you to read, perhaps, and we could have it expanded to make it easier, paragraphs 4 to 6. Before we move over the page, I'd like you to note in particular what it says about your own role and also what it says about Detective Sergeant Lambert being able to spend his time most usefully in a cell with other activists. Could we go over the page to 7, please? Can you help us with your recollection of events on the day, and in particular the role you played?
When an SDS officer goes outside of the Metropolitan Police, it was normal practice to send someone from the office, as we call it, as cover, should they come into police custody. That, on this occasion, was my role. I was there at the police station when he was arrested. I saw him being brought in, and I then made inquiries as to what was going to be the outcome. It was decided by Sussex Police that he would not be charged, but he was held in a cell for a couple of hours and then released.
How were you dressed?
Casually.
Activist casually or police officer casually?
I couldn't dress up like an activist. I didn't look like them. I was just casually dressed.
Who did you speak to in the police station?
Oh, probably, if he was there, the DI of Special Branch if he was there, maybe the DCI if he was there. I cannot be specific as to who it was.
And what did you tell them about who you were?
Oh, they knew who I was. I was a DI from Special Branch, and I would have told them that we had an informant within the grouping down there.
But not an undercover police officer?
I didn't use those terms, no. Then, when I found out that there were to be no charges, I saw no reason to disclose our interest any further.
Are you sure that you did actually speak to a police officer, or did you stand completely out of the way?
No, because I wouldn't have got into the police station unless I'd spoken to somebody and told them why I was there, in general terms.
How does that square with the policy of allowing your officers to maintain their cover identities, A, upon arrest, and B, through minor criminal charges?
Well, D.S. Lambert maintained his cover. He was arrested, yes, but he wasn't charged with any offence.
Did you identify Lambert as your informant?
No.
How did Lambert use his incarceration to good purpose?
My understanding is he was ensconced in a cell with other activists from, I think, the Brighton area, and they spent a couple of hours talking, which gives rise to my last paragraph there, that he had obtained some very useful intelligence.
What was the useful intelligence?
I can't remember now.
Your witness statement says, similarly to your oral evidence, concerned Brighton and South West groups of the ALF. If he'd elicited something particularly important, it would have been recorded, wouldn't it?
Presumably.
Was there an element of trying to put a positive spin on this report when your officer had been arrested?
I don't regard what I said in that report as spinning anything. He had done an excellent job there, and he deserved the accolade I've given him there, that he'd obtained some very useful intelligence.
What was excellent about getting arrested?
There's nothing excellent about getting arrested. I wasn't there when he was arrested. The fact that he had been with these people and got this intelligence was the accolade.
Can we go back to the first page, please, and expand it so that we can see the file reference?
Yeah.
One of the most esoteric questions I'm going to ask you today is about file reference 588/unreg/694E. This was a file for SDS matters.
Yes.
Was it a file upon which events like the arrest of an officer would be documented?
My understanding on this, and I may be wrong, but my understanding is this particular report would have been located on that paperwork, but then the substance of it would have been produced to go on to other registered SB files.
So what was kept on 588 unreg 694E?
Again, I cannot be sure, but I think you will find they are what you call policy files.
And would adverse events be amongst the things that would go on that file if an officer had misconducted himself or got involved in a traffic accident?
Possibly.
That sort of thing.
Possibly.
Did you look at that file when you joined the SDS?
No. They were kept over at Scotland Yard. I wouldn't have had access to them then. I could have looked at them, I suppose, if I wanted to, but they were general files.
Wouldn't it have been a good idea to look at the SDS policy file to familiarise yourself with the unit you were going to manage?
Well, I wouldn't have had access to it until I got there, and I was learning on the job there, as I've described before. I'm not sure a policy file would have been of great help to me at that time.
Can we take it then that you probably didn't look at it? Thank you. Could we take that down now, please? I want to ask you some questions next about the approach to animal rights deployments. Would it be fair to say that top of your agenda were the more serious crimes that were being committed in the name of animal rights?
The first point I would make is that I didn't have the agenda. The agenda was held by the squad chief, where animal rights were dealt with, which I suspect was C Squad at the time. To quantify that answer, yes, the more serious offences that animal rights activists would come out with would be top of the list.
Just to be clear, what was your responsibility in providing intelligence that met the customer's needs, in this case, the animal rights desk on C Squad?
My responsibility was to make sure that the officers were targeted at the groupings that the chief superintendent of the squad required.
And the officers conducted themselves properly and serviced the intelligence requirement?
Yes.
To target the serious crimes being committed in the name of animal rights using an undercover officer meant the officer would have to prove themselves to get close, wouldn't they?
One would assume so.
They were using a cell structure, weren't they?
Yes.
And that might be a little grand for what was happening in practice. People were encouraged, incited to go out and commit crimes in the name of animal rights, weren't they? Sometimes entirely on their own, other times in small groups.
So I understand.
To get into a group that was committing crimes as serious as planting improvised incendiary devices in department stores and so on would require building up a considerable amount of trust, wouldn't it?
I would assume so.
In the words of one of our witnesses, you'd have to show you were up for it.
Yes.
And they would have to feel that they could trust the officer, A, to get involved in a serious conspiracy, and B, to keep their mouth shut.
Yes.
That poses a dilemma to the undercover police officer, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
You say that, a very serious dilemma, isn't it? Not an easy problem.
Nope.
Did you ever discuss with your animal rights UCOs how they would inveigle themselves deeply enough to be accepted on a serious ALF enterprise?
Did I discuss it with them, how they would do it? No.
Did you discuss with Bob Lambert how he was going about the task of infiltrating the animal rights movement so as to gain intelligence about the ALF?
Bob was already established when I went to the SDS. He was a very shrewd man, and I would not have discussed something like that with him because he would have had his own ideas.
Did he ever raise it with you?
No.
Would it be fair then to say that you left him entirely to his own devices?
No. No. We would see him twice weekly, and in later events have individual meeting with him to see exactly what the scenario was. He would also have been reminded about his duties as a police officer and that he was not to commit a crime, and Bob knew that full well.
When would he have been reminded of that?
We would have told him. I can't give you a specific, but when we get into serious stuff like that, he would have been told.
Again, can you help us paint a picture of the sort of topics you were talking to Bob Lambert about before the Debenhams attacks? What were you talking to him about at the meetings?
Well, there would have been general chat when everybody's present, and then, if it needed it afterwards, there would have been a specific meeting with him on a specific issue. I can't give you dot and comma on it because I simply don't remember.
Could we have up, please, 730597? This is a much later document. It's from January 1993. It's a report about changes to performance measures, management arrangements, and potential for development on the SDS. Could we go to page 16, please? Could we have a look at paragraphs 3.8 and 3.9? Thank you. Since those early years, arrests have been relatively few, and it is to the credit of the officers involved that on many occasions where involvement in crime was proffered, excuses have been found, such as blank, to avoid involvement in the actual event. The higher risk fields for involvement in crime are anti-fascist activity, anarchism, and animal rights. In the last mentioned field, in order to gain full acceptance and trust, participation in illegal activities is essential. This level is progressive from inspections of premises where no criminal offences are actually committed, through the housing of liberated animals, daubing and other minor damage to premises, through to product contamination, arson, and the use of improvised explosive devices. These are the words of an official report some years, as I've said, after your time directly managing the SDS. Was it your view that participation in illegal activities was essential for an undercover officer in the animal rights field?
By illegal activities, I go back to what I said earlier. Would, for instance, a demonstration in the street be termed illegal in terms of a police officer, an undercover officer, taking part in it? This was written, obviously, in regard to later matters, but I'm not sure exactly from this where you would be able to draw the line, and you would have to have a line somewhere.
Yeah, well, we're rather short of documents drawing lines.
Yes.
And you've told us that you weren't provided with any, but what I'm interested in is, up to what level of gravity did you think it was essential for a UCO to participate in criminal activity in order to gain requisite animal rights intelligence?
Minor activity only, and if anything else were to be promulgated, that would have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis.
And the problem is, a little bit of fly posting isn't going to prompt people to tell you they're going to plant an IID in a department store, is it?
No.
This document clearly envisages participation in much more serious offences, doesn't it?
I think it does.
Was that discussion ever had whilst you were managing the SDS?
No, bearing in mind this is about 6 years after I left. No. Again, as I've said, if there was anything that came up, it would be dealt with on an individual basis, depending on the circumstances.
Did you discuss the issue with either DCI Waite or DCI MacLeod?
In general terms, no.
Is a compounding problem for the SDS on this issue that it is committed to long-term intelligence gathering operations, isn't it?
Correct.
Very different to an evidential deployment in which it's envisaged the undercover officer will eventually give evidence in court.
Yes.
Would it be right to say that an additional dimension that you therefore had to deal with, as well as having your officers in the right place to get intelligence about serious crime, you also wanted to be on a basis where they could continue their deployments after the requisite intelligence had been extracted?
Yes. We would like them to continue in post.
Did you consider the challenges of using a long-term intelligence gathering UCO to inform a criminal investigation and prosecution?
No.
Do you see challenges?
Do I see challenges?
Yes.
The primary role of an SDS officer was to provide intelligence. They were not there to end up in court giving evidence in a criminal case. That would not have been their role.
Did you see a tension between seeking that outcome and people being prosecuted for serious offences following an investigation informed by such intelligence?
I'm not sure what you mean by the word tension, but I didn't see a problem with it because the officers knew that they were not to get heavily involved in criminality. And if they did, they realised that that would probably be the end of their posting on the SDS.
Do you think you are equipped training-wise to manage an undercover police officer in a long-term intelligence gathering operation who went on to provide intelligence that was used to inform a criminal investigation and subsequent prosecution?
Initially, no. There was no training at all. It was on-the-job training. I'm not sure at the end of the day whether I actually fully understood all the ramifications of it, because as an SDS office, a unit, you are isolated.
And would it be right to say, as a special branch officer, you didn't have a great deal of experience of criminal litigation?
I'd accept that.
So would that be a convenient moment to take the morning break?
Yes, it would. We will now have a quarter of an hour break to enable the transcriber to have a break, and you.
Now, this is a report dated the 24th of July. It talks about Clark seeking a new location at which to manufacture further IIDs. But can we look, for my immediate purposes, at paragraph 4, please? Clark and his trusted comrades are agreed that Debenhams should be given until the 1st of October 1987 to remove furs from all their stores. In the meantime, he plans to have devices ready for use against other retail outlets for the fur trade. Provisionally, it would appear that the most likely targets will be Harrods and C&A in Oxford Street. Again, did you inquire at all as to how Lambert knew that?
Almost certainly not.
Or to ask him how close to Clark Shepherd was?
No.
Or how close to Clark Lambert was?
No.
How frequently were you talking to Lambert in the aftermath of these important attacks?
I can't remember. We would have talked to him normally at the weekly meetings on Monday, on Thursday, and if anything occurred outside of the meetings as well.
Would it be right to take away from that answer that you're painting a picture of business as usual? Or was it different, given the gravity of what had happened?
This was very important, and it was probably the leading problem that SDS had at that time in obtaining this type of intelligence. So it was something that we would have kept a firm grip on.
But not firm enough to ask Lambert how he was getting the intelligence.
Didn't need to ask him that. I didn't see it as a priority.
Could we take that down now and have 735383 up, please? This is a report from the 11th of August. If we could go to the report itself. Paragraph 2, please. What's been committed to paper here is intelligence that Andrew Clark not only manufactured the IIDs, but he planted the devices at the Luton store, the one where very extensive fire damage was occasioned. Goes on to say 2 close and trusted comrades were responsible for planting devices at the Harrow and Romford branches. Their identity is not known at present. This is important intelligence, isn't it?
Correct.
Did you discuss it with Lambert at all?
I can't remember.
This is exactly what the senior officers you'd met back in July wanted to know, wasn't it? Who did it? Could we go to paragraph 4, please? I'll give you a moment to read that. Even greater regard for security was going to be had. What did that make you think?
At the time, it would have said to me that Bob was at the top echelon of the ALF and had access to very, very detailed intelligence of their intentions.
It essentially tells you, in conjunction with the intelligence he's reporting, Lambert is in the cell, isn't he?
I don't know if he's in the cell, but he's very close to it, certainly.
How else would he get information like this?
I don't know. It's very, very detailed.
Did you show any inquisitiveness as to whether he was in the cell or not?
Not that I can remember, no.
Did you actually know that in fact he was in the cell?
No.
Thank you. Can we take that down now, please? Could we have up 735359, please? This is a minute sheet, and it's about preparing to commence surveillance of Clark. Were you involved in discussions with senior managers about commencing surveillance on Clark?
I don't recall, no.
They're awaiting confirmation from the source. That's Bob Lambert, isn't it?
Yes.
So you would have been involved in relaying Bob Lambert's intelligence up the chain so a decision could be made to commence surveillance.
Yes, in conjunction with the DCI.
Could we take that down now, please? Have 735382. That's, yes, the report. The report is 18th of August 1987. Can we have paragraph 2, first of all, please? On Thursday, the 13th of August and Saturday, the 15th of August 1987, an active London cell of the Animal Liberation Front held secret meetings in North and East London. Only 4 people were present. Did it strike you as odd that they are not named?
I don't know. Are they named at the end of the report? I can't see.
No. There's reference we'll come to later on to Clark and Shepherd, and it's obvious that they were there, but the other 2 are not named. One of them, Bob Lambert?
Presumably.
Why isn't the 4th person named?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Bob.
Did you ask Bob?
No.
Could we have paragraph 4, please? I'll give you a moment to read that. So we're told here for the first time in writing that Shepherd planted 2 devices at the Romford branch. Said this is 18th of August. Why did it take him so long?
I don't know.
Did you ask him about it?
Probably not.
Did you rib him about it?
I don't know.
This again is talking about security precautions, and the security precaution that's being discussed is separating the device manufacturers, Clark and Shepherd, from the planters. The planters aren't identified here. Did you have any idea who the planters were going to be?
I can't remember at that time.
Somebody was going to have to find planters who did not know that Clark and Shepherd were going to build the devices?
Presumably.
That's a task within the cell which might naturally have fallen to Bob Lambert as one of the people who was not going to manufacture the devices.
Supposition.
A warning bell that might have rung for you?
I don't know if it did at the time.
Did you discuss with him how that was going to happen?
I don't recall it.
Was this an important report from your point of view?
Well, it would have been, yes.
Can we go to paragraph 10, please, which is on another page? Give you a moment to read that. It's about what's going to happen if Debenhams ignore the 1st of October 1987 deadline. Are you able to help us with whether or not there was any communication between any part of Special Branch and Debenhams?
That would not have been in my remit on the STS. That would have been either between C Squad, maybe Arnie and Debenhams.
Yeah.
I don't know of any.
Yeah, I understand that it wouldn't have been your personal job necessarily. I just wanted to know if you knew whether Debenhams were being assisted to protect themselves from crime by intelligence provided by the SDS.
I don't know.
Could we take that down and have 735361 up, please? This is August. We're back to the question of surveillance. If we could have a look at minute 10 first, please, at the top of the page. I'll give you a moment to read that. And if we could just go down far enough to see the signature, whose signature it is.
Yeah.
It's Mr. Short, the
Yeah.
Detective Chief Superintendent. Very keen to start evidential surveillance, but also concerned about operational security, presumably of Bob Lambert and the SDS.
Correct.
And you are to be brought into a discussion about that.
Right.
Can you recall that discussion?
I can't.
What would the operational security concerns connected with the commencement of a surveillance operation have been?
He talks here about an evidential surveillance operation. In my experience, all surveillance is evidential. So it didn't need that. I think what Mr. Short was getting on about here is the protection of the SDS officer in what is likely to be a very serious criminal offence.
In what sense?
In that we do not want the source participating in any form of criminal offence.
Do you not want the source to appear on any surveillance photographs either?
It would be good if he didn't, but I don't think that would have been a possibility at the time.
If they're used in a subsequent prosecution, used evidentially, it begs questions as to who he is, doesn't it?
It could produce
And
that.
draw him into a trial.
Yes.
Was that a consideration?
That might have been in Mr. Short's mind at the time. I don't know.
Doing the best you can now, what would your input into this conversation have been?
If there's a surveillance operation against Shepherd initially, I would have made sure that Bob knew about that so that he could, if possible, distance himself from Shepherd. The likelihood is that people on the surveillance team would have recognised him straight away. Bob, that is.
Were photographs taken that depicted Bob Lambert?
I don't know.
Could we take that down now, please, and have 735381? This is a briefing note, but the second paragraph, it's 24th of August, second paragraph is the result of some of the surveillance, and it's combined, as you will see at the end of the paragraph, with intelligence from a secret and reliable source. It's about the transfer of bags, and the secret and reliable source is confirming that what's in the bags were the component parts for IIDs. Bob Lambert was the source of that, wasn't he?
I don't know, I presume so.
Did he speak to you about that?
I don't remember it, no.
Presumably you would have fed the intelligence from Mr. Lambert up the chain?
Yes.
Wasn't that important intelligence?
Yes.
Can you not remember that coming in?
No.
If we go to the fourth paragraph, please. Since been learned that the contact at Privacy Grove Road E3 is MSW, that's where the components have come from. Little is known about this man, but he is believed to be performing the role of quartermaster in this affair. We're not giving out MSW's name. You can check it on the key if you want to. Did Bob Lambert identify MSW to you?
See, I don't know who it is. I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost on MSW, where I'll find this. But I don't...
I'll tell you what, as it's just coming up to 1 o'clock, we can deal with that over the lunch adjournment. And I will move on and ask you, paragraph 1, this is the plan. If we go to page 2, at the top of page 2, there's reference to Helen Steele. Helen Steele of Linden Road, N15, is the only other principal figure to emerge in this inquiry. However, as intelligence shows that she is most unlikely to have anything incriminating at her address and to facilitate source protection, it is recommended that her premises should not be searched. Was source protection a part of the decision not to search Helen Steele's address?
I don't know. Possibly.
And why was it necessary for source protection?
I don't know, is the answer to that. It possibly is because Bob was the only one who had been given any access to her place. And also, from his knowledge of her, he probably knew she wouldn't have anything there, so he thought it would be a waste to search her premises there.
Source protection is your responsibility, yeah, isn't it, at this time?
Yeah.
Would you have discussed it with Bob Lambert?
I can't remember if I did or not.
Would you have done?
Maybe not. That may have been a bit higher up the chain. I don't know.
So would now be a convenient moment to break for lunch?
Certainly. Before we rise, could I ask you to reflect, please, over the lunch break about the document that appears at 073538 that is the report by Bob Lambert of 2 meetings on the 13th and 15th of August, the report being dated the 18th of August 1987.
Yes, sir.
That is a detailed report about the plans of a cell of no more than 4 people at that stage to commit serious offences a little later. I want you to reflect on what, if anything, you said to Lambert about his participation in that cell. But I'm not asking for an instant answer. You give one after you've reflected upon it. I'd be grateful. We'll now rise for an hour and start again at 5 past.